the gift that refused a name. The rain had been falling since before dawn, not heavy enough to scare people indoors, but persistent enough to soften the edges of the city, turning sidewalks into mirrors and headlights into slow-moving streaks of light. Sandra Bullock sat alone near the window of a quiet cafe on the edge of a film-set town no one ever talked about, her hands wrapped around a warm mug she hadn't taken a sip from in minutes. Outside, people hurried past without noticing her, umbrellas tilted low, minds busy with their own lives, and she felt oddly grateful for the invisibility. Fame had taught her many things over the years, but one lesson had stayed with her more stubbornly than the rest. The most important moments in life were almost always the ones that happened when no one was watching. She wasn't here for a scene, not really. Filming had wrapped early that day, and the crew had scattered back to hotels and restaurants, but Sandra had asked for time alone, claiming exhaustion. In truth, she had felt something tug at her all afternoon, an unease she couldn't name, the kind that made her restless even when everything around her seemed calm. It was the same feeling she had known as a child when she sensed someone needed help before they ever asked for it. That instinct had never left her, no matter how loud the world around her became. Across the street from the cafe stood a narrow building with peeling paint and a flickering sign that read Community Learning Center. One of the bulbs was burned out, leaving the word learning half swallowed by darkness. Sandra had noticed it earlier while being driven back from set. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. Then she saw a boy no older than 10 standing at the door, holding a backpack with a broken strap, waiting as if unsure whether he was allowed inside. When the door finally opened, he slipped in quickly, relief written all over his face. That small moment stayed with her. It followed her into the cafe, into her thoughts, into the quiet space she carried inside herself. Without thinking too much, she paid for her untouched drink and stepped back into the rain. The closer she got to the building, the clearer the signs became. Cracked windows patched with cardboard, a notice taped crookedly to the door announcing reduced hours due to lack of funding, the faint smell of old books and damp paper leaking into the street. Inside, a handful of children sat at mismatched tables, coats still on, heads bent over notebooks under dim lights that hummed like they were struggling to stay awake. An older woman moved between them, offering gentle guidance, her smile tired but sincere. No one looked up when Sandra entered, and she was grateful for that, too. She stood near the entrance for a long moment, taking it all in, feeling something tighten in her chest. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. She had seen places like this before in cities all over the world, spaces held together by dedication and hope rather than money. Places that survived only as long as someone cared enough to keep them alive. She knew how these stories often ended. One day, the lights went out for good, the doors closed, and the children learned another quiet lesson about loss long before they should have. Sandra left without saying a word, stepping back into the rain with her hood pulled low, her heart heavier than when she arrived. That night in her hotel room, while the town slept and the rain tapped softly against the window, she opened her laptop. She didn't call her team. She didn't ask for advice. She searched quietly, patiently, until she found the foundation account she had set up years earlier for moments exactly like this. It wasn't large by Hollywood standards, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to arrive at the right place, at the right time. The transfer took less than 5 minutes. No name, no message beyond a single line she typed and erased 3 times before settling on words that felt honest and small enough to disappear into the world without drawing attention. For the children who still believe tomorrow can be better. She closed the laptop, sat back, and exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding inside for weeks. There was no sense of triumph, no desire to tell anyone, only relief. What Sandra didn't know was that across town, in a modest apartment overlooking a parking lot, Keanu Reeves sat awake at his own kitchen table, staring at a handwritten letter he had received earlier that evening. It was from a friend who volunteered at a youth shelter nearby, the kind of place Keanu had quietly supported for years, never announcing it, never attaching his name. The letter spoke of funding cuts, of programs about to be canceled, of kids who had nowhere else to go after school. Keanu read the words slowly, carefully, as if each sentence carried weight he couldn't afford to ignore. He understood this feeling well, the quiet pull toward action, the certainty that doing nothing would feel heavier than any sacrifice. He folded the letter neatly and set it beside his tea, staring out at the dark city beyond his window. Over the years, he had learned that kindness wasn't a grand gesture. It was a habit, a responsibility, something you showed up for again and again, even when no one noticed, especially when no one noticed. He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found a number he rarely used but never deleted. Sandra. They hadn't spoken in weeks, both busy, both respectful of each other's silence. But something told him tonight was a night meant for honesty, even if only in fragments. When Sandra's phone buzzed on the nightstand, she almost ignored it. Then she saw his name. She answered quietly, her voice low, like she didn't want to wake the world. They didn't talk about movies or schedules or awards. They talked about the rain, about the town, about how strange it felt to be surrounded by people and still feel alone sometimes. Keanu mentioned the shelter without naming it. Sandra mentioned the learning center without explaining why. There was a pause between them, filled with understanding neither needed to explain. "Do you ever worry," Keanu asked softly, "that the world only notices the noise now, not the quiet things that actually matter?" Sandra smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Sometimes," she said, "but I think the quiet things still land where they're supposed to, even if we never see it." They said goodnight without promises, without plans, both unaware that two separate acts of unseen generosity were about to ripple outward in ways neither could predict. By morning, the learning center would receive an email that would make the older woman cry at her desk, unsure who to thank. By the end of the week, the youth shelter would stay open, its lights still on when the sun went down. And somewhere between those moments, a story would begin to form, not loudly, not all at once, but patiently, waiting for the day it would refuse to stay hidden any longer. What began as kindness without a name was already finding its way into the world, weaving together lives that had never met, setting the stage for a truth that would one day surface not as scandal or spectacle, but as a reminder that some of the most powerful forces on Earth move silently, carried forward by people who never intended to be seen at all. When silence begins to echo, the morning after the rain felt deceptively ordinary, the kind of calm that arrives without warning and convinces people that nothing important is happening beneath the surface. Sandra woke before her alarm, the pale light of dawn slipping through the curtains of her hotel room, carrying with it a strange mix of peace and restlessness. She lay still for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and early footsteps in the hallway, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, her thoughts returned immediately to the learning center across the street. She imagined the children arriving that day, unaware that anything had changed, unaware that a quiet decision made in the dark hours of the night had already begun to alter the direction of their small world. That anonymity comforted her. It reminded her that goodness didn't need witnesses to be real. On the other side of the city, Keanu Reeves had already been awake for hours. He had gone for one of his long, early morning rides, the kind that cleared his mind more effectively than any conversation ever could. The city passed by in muted colors, buildings still half asleep, streets breathing slowly before the rush of the day began. As he rode, he thought about the shelter his friend had written about the kids who relied on that place not just for food or safety, but for a sense of belonging they couldn't find anywhere else. He didn't think of it as charity. He never had. To him, it was simply a responsibility that came with having more than enough when so many others had far too little. When he returned home, there was a voicemail waiting. It was short, breathless, filled with disbelief and gratitude. The shelter's director explained that an unexpected donation had come through overnight, large enough to cover their expenses for the next year. No name, no conditions, just funds and a short note wishing them strength. Keanu sat at his kitchen table afterward, phone resting in his hand, feeling that familiar quiet satisfaction settle over him. It wasn't joy exactly, and it certainly wasn't pride. It was more like alignment, like something inside him had clicked back into place. Neither he nor Sandra knew that, in the same hour, the older woman at the learning center unlocked the door with trembling hands. She had arrived early, intending to reorganize shelves and ration supplies the way she always did when money was tight, but an email waited for her on the aging computer behind the front desk. As she read it, she had to sit down. The donation wasn't just enough to keep the center open. It was enough to repair the roof, replace the flickering lights, buy new books, and extend their hours so the children could stay longer after school. She cried quietly, wiping her eyes before the first child arrived, unsure who to thank but certain that someone out there believed this place mattered. Days passed and life continued as it always did on the surface. Filming resumed. Interviews were scheduled. Schedules filled. Sandra returned to set, smiling when required, delivering lines with practiced ease, but something inside her felt lighter, as if she had set down a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Keanu, too, moved through his routines with the same quiet humility that had always defined him. taking calls, meeting obligations, but always carving out time to check in on the people and places he supported, never attaching his name, never seeking acknowledgement. What neither of them realized was that silence, once broken, has a way of echoing. The learning center's sudden revival didn't go unnoticed in the town. Parents whispered about it while waiting for their children. Local volunteers talked. Someone mentioned the donation to a small regional paper, framing it as a human interest piece about anonymous generosity. The article was modest, barely read outside the county, but it planted a seed. A similar article appeared weeks later about the youth shelter Keanu had helped, again praising an unnamed donor who had stepped in just in time. On their own, the stories meant little. Together, they began to form a pattern. Far away in another quiet town that had once hosted a film crew years earlier, a librarian clipped one of those articles and pinned it to a corkboard behind her desk. She remembered a night long ago when funding had arrived out of nowhere, saving her library from closure. She remembered the note that came with it, the careful wording, the absence of a name. For years, she had assumed it was a one-time miracle. Now, reading about similar miracles elsewhere, she felt something stir. Coincidence, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Meanwhile, Sandra and Keanu met for dinner one evening after a long day, choosing a small, unremarkable restaurant where no one expected to see them. They talked about ordinary things at first, laughing softly, sharing stories from set, commenting on how strange it felt to grow older in an industry obsessed with youth. Eventually, the conversation drifted, as it often did, toward deeper ground. Sandra mentioned the learning center again, more openly this time, describing the children, the smell of old books, the way the place had felt like a fragile promise. Keanu listened carefully, nodding, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he told her about the shelter, about the letter that had started everything, about the voicemail that followed. There was a pause between them, heavy with recognition. They didn't congratulate each other. They didn't compare amounts or outcomes. Instead, they shared a quiet smile, the kind that comes from knowing you're not alone in seeing the world the same way. "Do you ever think," Sandra said softly, "that one day people will connect the dots?" Keanu considered this, then shrugged gently. "Maybe," he said, "but if they do, it won't change why we did it." She nodded, relieved by his certainty. In that moment, she realized how rare it was to share this part of herself with anyone, rarer still to be understood without explanation. Elsewhere, the pattern continued to grow. A clinic that had once been on the brink of shutting its doors received help. A music program for underprivileged children found itself suddenly funded. In every case, the story was the same, anonymous, timely, quietly transformative. A few curious minds began to notice similarities. The towns, the timing, the connection to film locations. What had once been silence was slowly turning into a question. Sandra felt the shift before she saw it. It came in the form of an email forwarded by her assistant, a polite inquiry from a journalist asking whether she had any connection to a recent anonymous donation in a town where she had filmed years earlier. Sandra stared at the message for a long time, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't respond. She deleted it instead, telling herself it was nothing, that curiosity would fade. But curiosity rarely does. Keanu experienced something similar days later, a casual comment from a friend who mentioned seeing his name speculated about online in connection with a charitable act he had never spoken of. The speculation was lighthearted, almost admiring, but it unsettled him nonetheless. He had never feared being misunderstood. He had only ever feared that the focus would shift from the people being helped to the person doing the helping. That night, both of them sat alone in separate rooms, thinking about the same thing without knowing it. They had given quietly because they believed that was the purest way to give. But the world, loud and hungry for stories, didn't always respect quiet boundaries. And somewhere beyond their awareness, someone had begun to listen closely, determined not to praise or expose, but to understand. The silence that once protected their kindness was beginning to thin, and with it came the first hint that what they had tried to keep hidden might soon ask to be seen, not for recognition, but for meaning. The truth was no longer asleep. It was stirring slowly, patiently, preparing to step into the light. The truth that refused to stay buried. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly at first, then all at once. What had begun as scattered whispers across small towns slowly found its way into wider conversations, not because anyone was chasing fame, but because human curiosity has a way of leaning toward patterns it cannot explain. Sandra felt it in the subtle shift of questions during interviews, in the way journalists lingered a second longer than usual after the cameras stopped rolling, in the carefully phrased curiosity that pretended to be casual but carried a deeper intent. No one accused her of anything. No one even directly asked. But the air around her had changed, as if the world had tilted slightly, and she was the only one who noticed. Keanu sensed it too, though in his own quieter way. A longtime friend mentioned, almost jokingly, that his name had appeared in an online thread discussing anonymous donors connected to film locations. The tone wasn't harsh, but it was persistent, filled with speculation dressed up as admiration. Keanu listened, nodded, and changed the subject, but later that night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights outside his window, feeling an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. It wasn't fear of exposure. It was concern that something sacred might be misunderstood once pulled into the glare of public opinion. The person who truly felt the weight of the emerging truth, however, lived far from Hollywood, in a modest apartment filled with papers, books, and half-finished coffee cups. Her name was Claire Dawson, and for nearly 3 years she had been quietly following a story most people overlooked. She wasn't chasing a celebrity scandal or a viral headline. She was chasing gratitude. As a child, she had spent countless afternoons in a struggling community library that had once been on the brink of closure, only to be mysteriously saved by an anonymous donation that arrived just in time. That library had shaped her love for stories, for truth, for the idea that unseen hands could change the course of a life. Now a journalist, Claire had stumbled upon a small article about another anonymous donation in a town she recognized, a town that matched the filming location of a movie she remembered vividly. At first, she dismissed the connection as coincidence. But then she found another article, and another, each one pointing to a different place, a different cause, yet all sharing the same quiet signature. No name, no credit, only impact. Slowly, methodically, Claire began to connect dots that others hadn't bothered to notice. She didn't rush. She read financial records, public filings, old news clippings, and forgotten press releases. She noticed how donations often arrived shortly after film crews left town, how they targeted places that rarely attracted attention, libraries, shelters, clinics, programs for children who had learned too early how fragile the world could be. And then she noticed something else, something that made her stop mid-sentence while reading late one night. 2 names appeared repeatedly in connection with those locations: Sandra Bullock, Keanu Reeves. Claire leaned back in her chair, heart pounding, not with excitement but with doubt. These were 2 of the most visible people in the world. If they wanted credit, they could have had it instantly. If they wanted headlines, the world would have handed them over gladly. The idea that they might be responsible for years of silent generosity felt almost unbelievable, and that disbelief made Claire more cautious, not less. She didn't want to be wrong. She didn't want to hurt anyone. More than anything, she didn't want to turn kindness into spectacle. While Claire dug deeper, Sandra tried to regain a sense of normalcy. She focused on her work, on her routines, on the quiet rituals that grounded her. But memories kept resurfacing, moments she had tucked away because they felt too personal to share. She remembered standing in a hospital hallway years earlier, reading to a child who couldn't sleep because pain made the night too long. She remembered repairing a music room she had stumbled upon during filming, listening from the doorway as blind children learned to play instruments that made their faces light up with joy. She had never told anyone about these moments, not even Keanu, because they belonged to something deeper than friendship or public image. They belonged to her understanding of what it meant to be human. Keanu, too, found himself reflecting more than usual. He thought about the first time he had helped someone anonymously, how it had felt awkward at first, like stepping into a role without a script. Over time, it had become instinctive. He gave not because he believed he could fix the world, but because he believed in meeting it where it was broken. Sitting alone late one evening, he wondered whether silence was still the best protection, or whether silence itself had become part of the story in a way he hadn't anticipated. The shift became impossible to ignore when a major entertainment blog published an article titled "Hollywood's Invisible Benefactors," outlining a theory about anonymous donations linked to filming locations. The piece didn't accuse anyone outright, but it named Sandra and Keanu as possibilities, framing them as examples of stars who had both the means and the reputation for compassion. Sandra read the article in her kitchen early that morning, her tea growing cold beside her. The words weren't cruel, but they were invasive, peeling back layers she had carefully kept private. Her phone rang minutes later. It was Keanu. He didn't mention the article at first. He asked how she was. She answered honestly, saying she felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected. When he finally brought it up, his voice was calm but serious. "If this keeps growing," he said, "we may have to decide how we want this story told or if we want it told at all." Sandra knew he was right. Silence had protected them for years, but now silence was allowing others to shape the narrative. She didn't want praise, but she feared misinterpretation even more. She feared that people would see calculation where there had only been compassion, strategy where there had only been instinct. For the first time, she wondered whether the world needed to hear the truth, not for her sake, but for the sake of what the truth represented. Meanwhile, Claire reached a point where research alone was no longer enough. She needed context. She needed to understand intent, not just evidence. Carefully, respectfully, she began reaching out to people connected to the donations: librarians, shelter workers, nurses, teachers. She didn't ask who had given. She asked what the giving had meant. The answers were remarkably similar. They spoke of hope arriving at the last possible moment, of feeling seen without being watched, of help that came without strings attached. One conversation in particular stayed with her. An elderly librarian described finding a handwritten note left with a donation years earlier, the ink slightly smudged, the words simple and sincere. Claire realized then that this wasn't a story about money. It was a story about intention, about choosing to act quietly in a world obsessed with recognition. As the days passed, the pressure built slowly but steadily. Sandra and Keanu continued their lives, outwardly unchanged, but inwardly aware that the truth they had buried out of humility was beginning to push back toward the surface. And Claire, sitting at her desk late one night, finally understood what she had been searching for all along. She wasn't chasing a reveal. She was chasing a reminder. A reminder that goodness didn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most important stories were the ones people never meant to tell. The truth was no longer a question of if, but how. And somewhere between fear and hope, between silence and speech, all three of them stood on the edge of a moment that would change not just their lives, but the way the world understood kindness itself. When the world begins to ask. By the time the fourth week arrived, silence had stopped feeling like protection and started to feel like pressure. Sandra noticed it first in the smallest details, the way a producer paused mid-conversation, as if deciding whether to ask something personal, the way a journalist's smile lingered just a fraction too long before an interview ended, the way her assistant hesitated before forwarding certain emails. Nothing was said outright, but curiosity had begun to circle her life like a quiet storm gathering strength. She had lived under public attention long enough to recognize the signs. The world wasn't accusing her yet. It was waiting. She tried to ground herself in routine. Mornings began with long walks, afternoons with work, evenings with books or old films that reminded her of a time before everything carried interpretation. But even in those quiet hours, her thoughts drifted back to the places she had helped, to the faces she had never expected to see again, to the idea that those moments might soon be dragged into a conversation she never wanted to have. She didn't regret what she had done, not for a second. What unsettled her was the possibility that the purity of those acts could be reduced to headlines, dissected, doubted, and repurposed for entertainment. Keanu felt the shift in a different way. He was less visible in his daily life, but the rumors reached him all the same, carried through friends, through online chatter, through casual remarks that hinted at something larger brewing beneath the surface. He had always believed that if you did something good, you let it go, trusting that it would find its own place in the world. Now he wondered whether letting go also meant surrendering control over how that goodness would be understood. Sitting on a bench in a quiet park one evening, he watched people pass by, each one carrying their own unseen burdens, and felt the familiar pull toward simplicity. He wanted this to stay simple. He feared the world wouldn't allow it. Claire Dawson, meanwhile, had reached a crossroads of her own. She had gathered enough evidence to write a compelling story, but something held her back from publishing it. The more she learned, the more responsibility she felt. This wasn't a scandal to expose or a mystery to sensationalize. It was a fragile narrative built on years of intention, humility, and restraint. She knew that once she released it into the public sphere, she would lose control over how it evolved. And yet, she also knew that the story was already slipping out in fragments, shaped by speculation rather than truth. Late one night, surrounded by notes and clippings, Claire made a decision. If the world was going to talk about this, it needed to be guided by care, not curiosity alone. She drafted an email, careful with every word, respectful in its tone, explaining who she was and why she was reaching out. She didn't accuse. She didn't demand. She simply asked for a conversation, one that would remain private unless permission was given otherwise. When she hovered over the send button, her hand shook slightly. She knew this message could change everything. Sandra received the email the next morning. She read it once, then again, her heart beating faster with each line. The name of the journalist stirred something familiar. A memory surfaced, faint but persistent, of a small library of a young girl who had once asked thoughtful questions about books and stories. She couldn't be sure it was the same person, but the possibility unsettled her. This wasn't a reporter chasing clicks. This was someone who seemed to understand the weight of what she was touching. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she called Keanu. They spoke quietly, their voices measured, both aware that this moment required more honesty than they usually allowed themselves. Sandra told him about the email, about the tone, about the sense that this journalist wasn't interested in praise or exposure. Keanu listened carefully, then said something that stayed with her long after the call ended. "If someone is going to tell this story," he said, "it should be someone who respects why it was never meant to be told." That evening, Sandra wrote back. Her reply was brief but open. She agreed to meet on one condition: no cameras, no recordings, no publication without consent. Claire read the response in disbelief, her chest tightening with relief and fear all at once. She hadn't expected a yes. She had only hoped for understanding. The meeting was set for 2 days later, in a quiet outdoor space away from studios and offices. When Sandra arrived, she wore no makeup, no accessories that might draw attention. She looked less like a public figure and more like a woman who had spent years carrying a secret she never intended to share. Claire stood when she saw her, nerves threatening to overwhelm her composure, but Sandra's gentle smile eased the tension instantly. They sat across from each other, the air between them heavy with unspoken understanding. Claire began by telling her story about the library, about the donation that had saved it, about how that single act had shaped her life and career. Sandra listened without interrupting, her eyes soft, her hands folded in her lap. When Claire finished, there was a long pause. Sandra looked out at the trees for a moment before speaking, as if choosing her words carefully. "I never wanted anyone to know," she said quietly. "Not because I'm ashamed, but because it was never about me. It was about them, about moments that didn't need an audience." Claire nodded, tears threatening to rise. She told Sandra that she understood that she hadn't come to expose her, but to protect the truth from being twisted. She explained that rumors were already spreading, that speculation was filling the silence, and that without context, people would assign motives that weren't real. Sandra felt a mix of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Fear, yes, but also a strange sense of relief. She had carried this alone for so long, convinced that silence was the only way to keep it pure. Now she wondered whether silence in this moment might allow the wrong story to take root. She didn't give Claire permission to publish. Not yet, but she didn't shut the door either. When the meeting ended, both women walked away changed. Claire felt the weight of trust settle heavily on her shoulders. Sandra felt the first crack in a wall she had built out of habit rather than necessity. That night she called Keanu again, telling him how the meeting had gone, how different it felt from every other interaction with the media she had ever experienced. Keanu listened, then admitted something he hadn't said aloud before. "Maybe," he said softly, "the world needs this story now. Not to celebrate us, but to remind people of something they've forgotten." The next morning, speculation intensified. New articles appeared, bolder than before, naming names more openly, framing generosity as strategy. Sandra read one headline and felt something inside her harden, not with anger, but with resolve. She realized then that silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences. She didn't make a public statement. She didn't schedule a press conference. Instead, she called Claire and asked to meet again, this time with Keanu present. If the story was going to be told, it would be told carefully, deliberately, with intention. Not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. The world was beginning to ask questions. And for the first time, Sandra was preparing to answer, not with defense, but with honesty. When kindness is put on trial. The days leading up to the second meeting felt heavier than anything Sandra had experienced in years. It wasn't fear of exposure that weighed on her, but the quiet understanding that once a story leaves your hands, it no longer belongs to you. She had built her life around choosing her words carefully, controlling what the public saw and what remained private, yet this was different. This wasn't about image or reputation. It was about intent, and intent was far harder to protect once millions of eyes began to examine it. Each morning, she woke with the same thought circling her mind. Had silence truly protected the goodness, or had it only delayed a reckoning? Keanu arrived at the meeting place first, choosing a quiet corner of a small garden cafe tucked away from the city's usual noise. He liked places like this, spaces that felt lived in rather than staged, where conversations could unfold without pressure. As he waited, he watched a woman at a nearby table help her child with homework, her voice patient, her attention undivided, and he felt again that familiar certainty that the most important acts in the world rarely happened on screens. When Sandra arrived moments later, she looked tired but resolved, carrying herself with the calm of someone who had made peace with an inevitable truth. Claire joined them shortly after, her notebook tucked under her arm but unopened. She made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't an interview, not yet. It was a conversation, one she intended to approach with care. They spoke for hours, not about money or amounts, but about moments. Sandra talked about the night she stood outside the learning center, unsure whether to go in, afraid that being seen might somehow contaminate the act. Keanu shared his belief that helping others was less about fixing problems and more about standing beside people while they faced them. Claire listened, absorbing not just their words but the quiet consistency between them. What struck her most was how little either of them wanted recognition. They spoke not as heroes, but as witnesses, people who had seen suffering up close and chosen not to look away. Claire realized then that the story she was holding wasn't about celebrities doing good. It was about humans choosing humility in a world that rewarded spectacle. She told them what was already happening beyond their control, how media outlets were sharpening their language, how narratives were forming that painted generosity as strategy and silence as guilt. Sandra felt a tightness in her chest as Claire spoke. She had always believed that truth would eventually stand on its own, but she was beginning to see how easily truth could be drowned out by noise. For the first time, she wondered whether saying nothing was no longer an act of humility, but an act of surrender. Keanu, sensing her struggle, placed a steadying hand on the table, grounding the moment. "If they're going to question it," he said quietly, "let them question something real, not a story they invented." The article Claire eventually wrote was unlike anything she had ever published before. It didn't lead with names or numbers. It led with a story about a library saved, about a shelter kept open, about children who never knew who helped them but felt the impact all the same. Sandra and Keanu were mentioned only in context, framed not as benefactors seeking praise, but as individuals who believed deeply in acting without applause. Before it went live, Claire sent it to them, honoring her promise. Sandra read it slowly, tears forming despite her efforts to stay composed. It felt honest, it felt careful, it felt right. When the article was published, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Some people responded with admiration, others with skepticism, and still others with outright cynicism. Social media lit up with debates, not just about Sandra and Keanu, but about the nature of charity itself. Was it ever truly selfless? Could anyone with fame and resources act without calculation? Sandra watched the conversations unfold from her living room, feeling strangely detached. She had known this was coming. What she hadn't expected was how little it mattered. The true impact revealed itself quietly, as it always did. Messages began arriving from people who had been helped over the years, letters filled with gratitude, but also with something deeper, understanding. One note from a teacher spoke of students who now had supplies and support they once lacked. Another from a nurse described how funding had allowed her hospital to keep a ward open during a crisis. These messages weren't addressed to Sandra or Keanu as celebrities. They were written to people, simply and sincerely. Yet the world outside was less gentle. A talk show host questioned their motives live on air, framing generosity as a calculated brand move. An opinion piece suggested that anonymity was just another form of control. Sandra heard about these things secondhand, choosing not to watch, but the words still reached her, carried by the unavoidable hum of public discourse. For a brief moment, doubt crept in, not about what she had done, but about whether she should have done it differently. Keanu called her that night, his voice calm and steady. "They can't take this away," he said. "What happened already happened. No headline can undo it." His certainty anchored her. She realized then that kindness once released was no longer fragile. It didn't need defending, it had already done its work. Claire, too, faced backlash. Some accused her of protecting powerful people. Others claimed she hadn't gone far enough. She read every comment, feeling the sting, but also noticing something remarkable. Beneath the noise, people were sharing their own stories of quiet generosity. Teachers buying supplies out of pocket, neighbors helping neighbors without asking for thanks. The article had become a mirror, reflecting a part of humanity that rarely received attention. Sandra understood then that the trial wasn't about her. It wasn't even about Keanu. It was about whether the world could still believe in goodness without needing to tear it apart. She didn't issue statements or defend herself. Instead, she returned to what she had always done best. She listened. She gave. She acted quietly, even as the spotlight burned brighter than she wanted. As the days passed, the sharpest criticism faded, replaced by something more enduring. A conversation. People began asking not who had given, but how they could give too. The story had slipped out of Sandra's control, but in doing so, it had found a life of its own. And in that realization, she felt something close to peace, even as the world continued to debate her intentions. Kindness had been put on trial, questioned, and dissected, but it had survived. Not because it was defended loudly, but because it had already proven itself in silence. The quiet ending that changed everything. Time has a way of settling what noise cannot, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to move on. Headlines shifted to newer scandals, louder controversies, faster stories that demanded less reflection and offered quicker judgment. The debates that once surrounded Sandra and Keanu softened into background murmurs, then faded altogether, leaving behind something far more enduring than public opinion ever could. What remained were the lives that had been touched, the doors that had stayed open, the children who continued to learn, heal, and dream without ever needing to know who made it possible. In that quiet aftermath, Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of completion that didn't require applause. She chose distance, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. The coastal town she moved to was small and unassuming, the kind of place where mornings smelled like salt and coffee and evenings belonged to the sound of waves rather than traffic. Here, she could walk unnoticed, buy her own groceries, sit on a bench and watch the horizon without wondering how it would be interpreted. She planted a small garden behind her home, tending to it patiently, finding comfort in the slow, honest work of nurturing something without expecting immediate results. The garden reminded her of everything she believed in, growth that happened quietly, steadily, without spectacle. Keanu visited when he could, always without announcement, always with the same ease that defined him. They would sit together on the porch, speaking little, sharing space more than conversation. There was a deep understanding between them now, forged not by shared fame but by shared values. They talked occasionally about the world, about how quickly it moved, how easily it forgot. Neither of them saw that as a loss anymore. Forgetting, they realized, was what allowed kindness to exist freely again, without being weighed down by expectation or judgment. Claire remained in contact, though less frequently than before. She had published a book eventually, not about Sandra or Keanu by name, but about the unseen hands that shape the world in ways few ever notice. The stories inside it belonged to librarians, nurses, volunteers, teachers, ordinary people doing extraordinary things without asking for recognition. The book resonated far beyond anything she had imagined. Readers wrote to her from around the world, sharing their own quiet acts of generosity, their own moments of choosing compassion when no one was watching. Claire understood then that the true power of the story had never been about who gave, but about what giving made possible in others. One afternoon, Sandra received a letter forwarded from an old address she rarely used anymore. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin. It was from the librarian whose learning center had unknowingly set everything in motion years ago. He wrote about children who now filled the shelves she had once seen held together by tape, about reading circles that had grown into after-school programs, about a young girl who had decided to study education because she believed places like that should never disappear. The letter ended without thanks, only a quiet acknowledgement that hope, once restored, had a way of spreading on its own. Sandra held the letter for a long time, feeling the weight of its simplicity. This, she realized, was the ending she had always wanted. Not recognition, not redemption, just continuation. The knowledge that something good had outlived the moment it was given. The Silent Hands Foundation, though never officially named or announced by her, continued its work through a network of people who believed in the same philosophy. It grew not through campaigns, but through trust. Funds appeared where they were needed. Help arrived before despair could fully settle in. Those who received support often paid it forward in ways no one tracked or measured. The foundation existed more as an idea than an institution, a reminder that generosity did not require ownership to be effective. Years passed. Sandra aged gracefully, content in a way fame had never quite allowed. She spent her days writing short notes of encouragement to strangers, volunteering quietly at local programs, listening more than speaking. Occasionally, she would catch sight of an article or a social post referencing the movement that had once surrounded her story, now stripped of names and faces, focused instead on action. She smiled every time, knowing that anonymity had finally returned to where it belonged. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ocean, painting the sky in muted golds and blues, Claire visited one last time. They sat together in comfortable silence before Claire spoke, her voice soft. She told Sandra that people still asked who had started it all, who the first silent hand had been. Sandra looked out at the water, her expression peaceful. "It doesn't matter," she said gently. "What matters is that it didn't stop." That night after Claire left, Sandra stood alone by the window, the same posture she had held years ago when rain traced lines down glass and a decision quietly took shape in her heart. She thought about everything that had followed, the fear, the questions, the trial of being misunderstood, and the unexpected grace that had emerged from it all. She understood now that silence wasn't about hiding. It was about letting go. Somewhere in the world, a child was opening a book in a warm room that might not have existed otherwise. Somewhere else, a family was finding shelter when they had none. Somewhere, someone was choosing kindness simply because they could. Sandra didn't need to see it. She felt it. And in that feeling, she finally knew she had done enough.